Hey, this is Melissa. Today we are going to get started with a new sew along. Today we are going to make ginger with sleeves. We're going to turn this sweet little sleeveless summer dress into a dress that can be worn year round by adding another Children's Corner sleeve. You have lots of options for the sleeves. Today I'm going to do a short sleeve from the Victoria pattern. You could also do the long sleeve from the Victoria pattern or the long or short sleeve from Ruthie. Those are both awesome. Other options would be Alex or Charlie or Lee. They all have great sleeves. The main thing you need to know about which sleeve you choose is that it has to be gathered. It must be a gathered sleeve to work with this process that we're doing. So go ahead and get your patterns together. So you need your ginger, and then you need whichever other pattern you're going to use for the sleeve, and you need to cut out those pattern pieces. Some of them may have a sleeve cuff and some might not, so be sure you get all the pieces that you need for those. You of course are also going to need your fabric, lining fabric and your main fabric. Today I'm going to make the view that is not lined in the skirt, so it's going to be view B. It has a lined yoke and bodice, rather lined bodice, but it does not have a lined skirt. That's what I'm going to do in the sew along today. I also have some, of course there's going to be some modifying we have to do on the armholes of this bodice. So you're going to need your tracing paper, a ruler and pencil, also a copy of the PDF that goes along with this blog that's going to have a little chart to tell you some measurements that we're going to use for modifying that armhole. You need your pattern instructions. If you have a French curve, you can grab that. You may want to use that. We're going to have a couple of different options for the way that we draw this curve for the new armhole. Anyway, go ahead and get all of that stuff together, and when you come back, we will work on modifying these pattern pieces. Okay, let's get started by just talking a little bit about the differences in the bodice between a sleeved dress and a dress that's sleeveless. For Children's Corner patterns, a dress that is sleeveless is going to come higher up under the arm, and it's going to come in on the shoulder. I'm going to show you a comparison of these two pattern pieces. This is my ginger back bodice piece, and this is a Victoria back bodice piece. And if I put them on top of each other, and we have to realize that ginger and Victoria are a little different in that one button's in the back and one button's in the front. But if I line up my centers and I line up my shoulders and I line up my side seams, you can see here that these curves are really quite different. So this one here on top is my Victoria, so it's going to be lower and it's going to come out further on the shoulder. So what we need to do is we need to make the sleeveless dress have an armhole like the sleeved dress so that it will work. If we didn't, if we just came and we wanted to just put a sleeve on this ginger with the higher armhole that it has, it's going to be tighter up under here. You would be able to get the sleeve on. It would be just fine if you put a gathered sleeve on, but the fit might not be just right because this would be higher than is comfortable. Also, the sleeve would fit a little bit further, closer to the neck than normally we have on a dress that's drafted by Children's Corner. So that's why it's important to change these out. So first thing you need to do is get your ginger back bodice piece, and let's trace a copy of it. I have started here. I'm going to show you what I did. We're going to start with the backs, and then you can do the front here in a little bit. But I have traced all the way around my ginger pattern piece, but when I got over to this armhole curve, I just did a dashed line. So go ahead and make a copy like that, and when you come back, we will make a few changes. I'm going to talk about two different ways that you can make this armhole curve work for you, work for this dress. And the first way is we are going to get the bodice piece out for the dress that you have taken the sleeve from. So since I'm doing a Victoria sleeve, I've got the Victoria bodice. If you were doing Ruthie or Alex, whatever else you might do, you need to get the bodice that goes with that sleeve. And I take my ginger pattern piece out here, and I've got my traced copy. I'm going to put this underneath. Now, I mentioned before how Victoria buttons in the back and ginger buttons in the front. So as far as lining up our pattern pieces, I need to be sure that I'm putting my fold line of my ginger that I've traced along the center back line of Victoria. So as long as you are at the center of both pieces, you're going to put your traced pattern piece on top of that center line. Now the next thing that you need to line up is the shoulder line. Now your necks may not match exactly, and that's okay because these are totally different patterns at the neck as well, but we do want the shoulder line to line up and the center line to line up. So you can see, I'm going to move it just a tad bit there to get those lined up there. And then also, if I do that, my side seam right over here should line up at the corner of the armhole. Now, Victoria, you know, all of these different patterns have a little bit different variations. Victoria happens to have darts, and so it is not going to necessarily line up exactly along the bottom. You also may find that, you know, some bodices are longer than others, so we're not really concerned about the bottom. But we are concerned about the center and the shoulder and the spot right down here, the side where it lines up, where they kind of intersect. So I don't know if you can see very well. Probably you can see. This is my dash line for where my ginger used to be. So all we're going to do is just draw in our new armhole. So all you do is just draw your new line, and I am just going to draw it real quickly here. Now, whenever you are, this is really the easiest way. All you're going to do is just come and cut on this new line, and that's going to take your armhole lower but out more at the shoulder. So that is one way to do it. Of course, after you've done that, you want to put all your pattern markings on there as well. So you'll need to have your fold line and all the identifying pieces for this pattern piece. I'm going to show you one other way to do it if you would like. I've got another piece here that I have already traced. And also, when we talk about markings, you know, it's good to say what size you're making. It's also good, I've also written on here, altered for sleeves. So I can stick this back in with my pattern pieces and have a new pattern if I ever wanted to do this again. Also, you know, I have, like, I'm cutting one on the fold, one of the lining on the fold, and then interfacing is optional. I am not going to use interfacing with this fabric that I'm making this dress with today, but if you were doing something very lightweight, you know, a batiste or a lawn weight, you certainly would want to consider interfacing your bodice pieces. So the other way that you can do this is you can go to the blog post, and there is a chart that tells you how much over you need to take your shoulder and how much down you need to take the area under your arm. Hope you can see that. So you go and you look at the chart for the size you're making, and I've got a copy of it right here. So I'm making a size 4. It says lower armhole on front and back bodice, 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to get my ruler out here, and I'm going to come to this spot right at the corner where my original ginger armhole was, and I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch down and just make a little mark there. And then I'm going to do up at the shoulder, I'm going to extend it out, and it says extend shoulder over on front and back bodice, and for this size it's 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to measure, see if I can find 5/8 on here, 5/8 of an inch, and come over. And I can actually even draw that little line out. Now I have 2 new points that my bodice piece needs to be. So it's going to be here and here are going to be the 2 spots that I'm going to use. Hopefully you can see this if I've drawn it dark enough. So it's going to be this lower one and this one here. So what you can do, if you happen to have a French curve, you can use that to just connect those lines. So it's going to be a look about like this, and you are going to connect your lower dot underneath your arm to the new dot that extends out on your shoulders. And you can draw a line like that, and that should make you a new curve that you can use for your armhole now. So that is another option. Once you have done all those things, I talked about pattern markings on the back pattern piece, but I do want to point out on your ginger, now your neck, all of this on your front ginger, once you've traced it, you know, you're going to have to do the same thing with the armholes here, but once you've done the front, there are some very important pattern markings that you need to be sure that you put on your pattern piece so that you can transfer them to your fabric later. One of them is this line right here. It's the collar placement for the left-hand side of your dress. This is where the ruffle is going to end. And then there's also a ruffle placement line over here on this center front. So be sure that once you have traced your new pattern, made your new armholes and everything, that you have these marks lined also. I also always mark my center front line. You can do the buttonholes if you would like, and that should be good for what you need. So go ahead and get all your pattern pieces traced and your pattern pieces cut out, and we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about some options for cutting out your dress, and then we will go from there. Okay, let's talk about a few details about cutting out your pattern pieces before you do it. You know, you always need to pay attention to the directional arrows on your pattern piece as you're cutting out, and most of them are going to be up and down or straight across. You're going to have an arrow like that, but there is one piece on the ginger where it's diagonal. So this is going to be cut on the bias. You can see that little line is diagonal. So you're going to lay this out on your pattern, on your fabric, on a diagonal as you cut it out. That's going to give this pattern piece, this fabric, a little bit of stretch to go around the neck, and it'll make it a nicer neckband than if it were just cut on the straight grain. You might also have a sleeve band, depending on which sleeve you choose, that's on the bias. So just pay attention to that. You know, since we're talking sleeves, there's a lot of different sleeve options that you could have done. Just be sure that you have cut out all of the appropriate pieces for that sleeve. You might even have a sleeve that's lined, so be sure that you've got the lining and the regular fabric for your sleeve. You might have piping. We don't have piping on the sleeve I'm doing today, but if you're doing Ruthie's sleeve, it has piping and it's lined. So just be sure you've got all of those pieces cut out according to those pattern pieces. Now let's talk a little bit about ginger and directional fabric. Now, most of the time when you think of directional fabric, it would be something that has a pattern that has to go up and down. So like these, this is just an example of a fabric that you would want to be pretty sure that you had the rainbows going the right direction. My fabric I'm using for this ginger doesn't really matter. It could go up and down either way. It didn't matter which way I laid my pattern pieces out. We talked about the directional arrows on pattern pieces and how it usually tells us how to draw them out or to lay them out. I'm going to show you on this particular pattern piece, this is the ruffle that goes up the front. It has a directional arrow this way, and it also has one this way. So it's kind of an option for which way you want to lay it out. And where that makes a difference is if you have a directional fabric. Now, ideally, you know, let's go back here to our rainbow fabric. Ideally, if you had your ginger made out of this, you would want all of your, everything, of course, you want your rainbows to be right side up, but you would also want your ruffle, which is going to be right across here, to have the rainbows going in the same direction. So in that case, you would want to use this long arrow to line your fabric up along the length of your skirt so that you had an up and a down in this direction. Now, there is also the option of doing it this way. You can see that arrow. So really, it doesn't matter as far as making the dress, which direction it is cut, but it does matter if you have a fabric that's directional. So just pay attention and decide as you're laying out which way you want that design on your ruffle to go. If you have that kind of fabric. Like I said, I don't have that kind of fabric here, but it is something that would probably drive me crazy if I had made a rainbow dress and then I had my ruffle rainbows sideways. That's just a me thing. But another thing to point out about this pattern piece is that if you're making a size 7 through 14, this is actually going to be 2 pattern pieces that you're going to stitch together to make your long ruffle strip. This one's just a 4, so mine is not going to be quite that long. So anyway, go ahead and cut everything out. Pay attention to how you're laying things out as far as that ruffle goes. After you have all your fabric laid out, you want to take your pattern markings and be sure that you put them from your patterns to your fabric. Now, we already talked about that a little bit with the front bodice. Be sure that you've marked all those areas on your fabric. Also, your back skirt pieces have some pattern markings. Your back skirt has just a couple of X's up at the top corners, but your front skirt has some lines down here towards the bottom corner that are important that you mark on your fabric. For whatever size you're making, you have a dot at the bottom that needs to be marked, and then you also have a ruffle placement line, which is right below that. So be sure that you've marked all of those on the inside of your fabric, on the wrong side of your fabrics. And once you've done that, we will be ready to get started at the sewing machine. Okay, let's get started with the actual sewing. Got my ginger instructions. That's important that we are going to follow these along. Now, the order that we do things is mostly going to follow the ginger, but there's going to be some things we're going to have to change up because we're adding a sleeve. And so there'll be a few little differences going along, but starting with step 1, we have already actually done that. That is all the marking of the pattern pieces. Hopefully you've taken care of that. Step 2 has to do with interfacing. So if you are using interfacing, that's what step 2 talks about. So follow those instructions. Step 3 is for view A. Now I mentioned before I'm doing view B. View A is if you're making a fully lined dress, if your skirt is going to be lined. So if you're going to do that view along with us, that's just great. But you need to be sure that you're paying attention and following those instructions in that step. I'm not going to go over it because that's not what we're doing with the dress I'm making today. But you can go ahead and take care of doing all of those things. And the next thing is step 4. And so what you may notice about this pattern is that the order that you do things may be a little bit different than in some other patterns, or that's something that I noticed, because the very first thing we're doing is we are stitching the skirts to the bodices. So in order to do that, you need some gathering stitches. So if you remember, on Children's Corner patterns, almost all of our seam allowances are 1/4 of an inch, with the exception of a few things, but the main exception to that rule is that anytime there is a skirt sewn to a bodice, it is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So because it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, our gathering stitches need to be 3/8 and 5/8 inch from the edge. And that just means that as far when I say lengthen stitch, that means about a 4 on my sewing machine as far as the length. And I'll set my machine there and stitch those all the way across in between the X's that you marked on your pattern pieces. Be sure as you are sewing these gathering stitches that you are sewing on the edge that is the top of your skirt, because the bottom of your skirt, so at least the front pieces, have some markings that you're going to need later to be at the bottom of the skirt. So go ahead and stitch all of those gathering stitches in place to your 3 pieces. You've got 2 front skirts and 1 back skirt, and when we get back we will put them together with the bodices. Okay, I told you we were going to talk about gathering, but I'm going to go back and say one more thing about pattern markings. There is a correction on the ginger pattern. So if you have the tissue version of the pattern, you need to make this correction in the markings going forward. And we did not do it the right way when we did it just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to explain what it is. It is that little dot that's at the bottom of the front skirt. Remember, we had made a little ruffle placement line marking, and then there was also a dot, and there's one for each size. And this dot needs to be moved. It needs to be moved 3 inches higher than it was. So if it was down here, it needs to be moved up into this area, just right above where it was, 3 inches. And that means that the distance from your new dot to the lower edge of the skirt is 7 inches. So go ahead and move that dot. And it's probably a good idea to write that in on your pattern piece just going forward, so you will know to do that. Another good thing to mark that I didn't mention is the center back of your back skirt and the center of your back bodice. That's going to help as we are doing the gathering to line everything up so you can get your gathers distributed a little bit more evenly. So, you know, what we need to do is we need to make the bottom of the bodice, which is going to be this width right here, we need to make it match the top of the skirt. So we're going to do that by pulling up the gathering threads. The first thing to point out is, you know, you have this side, this center area of your skirt that should be marked with your buttonholes. Be sure that as you are doing that, as you're lining it up, that you're using the pattern piece. You're not getting your rights and your left skirts mixed up. Be sure that the side that has your buttonholes marked is lined up with the side that's going to be the center of your bodice that should also have some buttonholes. So that way everything will be on the right edge of your fabric as far as your markings. So what you're going to do is line up your top edge, pin that in place, that first corner, and then we're going to pin the second corner in place, and you've got your stitching, your gathering stitches in place, and we are going to pull those top 2 threads, the ones coming off the top, to pull things up. Now I've already pulled this one on this side here, this left-hand side, to gather up this section. So now I'm going to go to the other side and just gather it up. I've secured these gathering stitches on this side with a little figure 8 wrap around the pin. And what you do is you just pull it up to where the 2 lengths match. And you can kind of pull it back and forth a little bit, trying to get it exact. I'm going to go ahead and wrap around this pin back and forth, and that's going to secure this section here so that I can now pull my stitches, pull my gathers, and even them out, distribute them all the way across. Now when you get to doing this on the back skirt, the reason that I had you mark your centers is you would have a place that's the center of the fabric on your skirt and the center of the fabric on your yoke to line up. Since that is such a long area, it's a longer area to gather than these front skirts, it's nice to have that middle marker. And we could have done it on this piece too, but it really wasn't quite as much of an issue since we're not gathering as wide of a piece of fabric here. But we are going to have so many gathering experiences with this dress that y'all are going to be really good at gathering and distributing, hopefully. So go ahead and distribute those where they look pleasing, where it's even all the way across as best you can. And we are still working on step 4 here. So gathering, putting in pins every inch or so that everything is lined up nicely. I've already done this one. You can see everything is, let me do it that way. You can see there's the back, and this is going to be the front. Now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch right along here. We're going to take our stitch length back to the regular normal length for your sewing machine. Around 2.5 is what it usually is on my machine. And we're going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way across here. Once you've done that, you trim your new seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and press everything up towards the yoke. So you're going to do that for all 3 of your pieces. You're going to have your 2 front skirt pieces and your back skirt pieces. Gather everything to the skirts, trim them to 1/4 inch, well, stitch it, then trim it to 1/4 inch, and then press everything up towards the yoke. Then we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, so now I have the bodices and the skirt stitched together. Once you've got all that pressed, you can go ahead and remove your gathering stitches. Then we'll move on to the next step, which has to do with the facings of the dress. So you should have 2 bodice bases, front facings or front bodice pieces that are lining, and then also these long, narrow facing strips. And what you need to do first, we are on step 5, and we're doing view B, remember, so that's what we're talking about. But you are going to go to the iron and iron over 1/4 inch along one long raw edge. Then after you've done that, go to the sewing machine, and you're going to top stitch along this edge. It'll probably be around 1/8 inch, maybe a little bit more than 1/8 inch along this edge to secure that down, to hold it down. And then I'm going to get your front lining piece, and we are going to line up the raw edge of the lining. This will be after you have that stitched, but you're going to do the raw edge of the facing to the raw edge of the lining. This will be your folded edge over here on this side, and you're going to stitch across the bottom on the short end of just this facing piece at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So once you've done that, you're going to end up with a look like this. So you've got your lining piece, and then you've got your facing piece down below. Once you have them stitched in place, you press everything up towards the yoke, and you're gonna, remember this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, so you're gonna continue that 1/2 inch press all the way across the top. So this is pressed and stitched down, and then you're stitching this piece to this piece and pressing all the way across. So you should have 2 pieces that look like this. Now my top lining is an alternate fabric, and my lower facing happens to be just like the skirt. I could have done them both the same, but I didn't. So that's what we've got going here. So go on and take care of all of that and come back and we will move on. Okay, so we're moving on from step 5 to step number 6. And this is just for sizes 7 through 14 if you have a ruffle that is in 2 pieces. So your pattern piece has a straight end and a curved end. So you are going to take the 2 pieces of fabric that have a straight end, and I'm just demonstrating with a little fabric here since my piece is actually all in one already since I'm on a 4. But you're going to take your 2 ends that are square and you're going to put them right sides together but perpendicular to each other. So you've made kind of this V shape. And let me just pin that real quick. And then what you're going to do is go to your sewing machine and you're going to stitch across this direction right here. And once you've done that, it's going to open, it'll open up like this, and you will have one long strip, and that will be what you will use for your ruffle piece. Of course, you will have stitched, you'll trim it to 1/8 of an inch and press it to one side, but that is how you create that long strip if you're making those bigger sizes. So if go ahead and do that if you are making a bigger size. And after that, either we're going to move on to step 7. What you're going to do is take your very long ruffle piece and you're going to fold it in half with wrong sides together, and then go to the sewing, then press it nice and flat, and then you're going to go to the sewing machine and you're going to stitch all along this edge with a lengthened machine stitch of about 4, 1/8 of an inch up from the edge, and then 3/8 of an inch from the edge all the way down. And that is going to be your gathering stitches so that you can gather this up to the front of your dress. So go ahead and take care of those things, and then we'll move on to step 8. Okay, we're ready now to get the ruffle gathered onto the front of the dress. So I have my ruffle ready with the gathering stitches in place, and I have the front of my dress. This is the top up here. Be sure that you're working with the right hand side of the dress as you're doing this so that your ruffle will be on the correct side. Also remember that we had some placement marks for our ruffle that we made earlier. If you made them on the back of your dress, you probably need to transfer some to the front, but there should be one right up here at the top at the neck, and then there's another one probably about 3.5 inches from the bottom of your skirt, and that is the space where this ruffle needs to fit once we get it all gathered up. So to start with, I'm going to trim the 2 back threads coming off of my gathering down to where they're just about 1 inch long, just to kind of keep them out of the way as we're gathering. That's just something that kind of helps. But take your top 2 threads here. You can see that if I move things away. And we're just going to start pulling and pull some gathers up into this strip. Now, I'm going to have a lot of moving around to do, and what this is going to do as we pull is it's going to curve that fabric around. So we're going to have one straight raw edge, but then the top and the bottom are going to curve because of the way we have stitched it. Now we just need to move all these gathers all the way down. I'm going to pull from one end until I get gathers down to about the middle of my strip, and then I'm going to pull from the other end. And you have to be a little bit gentle with this. I'm using polyester thread today, which helps with gathering. If you're using cotton threads, sometimes when you get to this point you can break the threads, and that's very frustrating. So polyester is certainly suggested for gathering threads for sure. But anyway, so we are going to keep pulling this. I'm not going to do it all on camera because it'll just take longer than we need. So pull all of these up until your ruffle goes in between those two spaces perfectly, and then we will come back and do a little bit more talking about it. So now we've moved to step 8. I have got my ruffle here, and it is gathered to the length between the ruffle placement lines. There's one up here at the neck and the other at the bottom of the skirt. I've marked those on my fabric, and then I've pinned the end of the ruffle, each end of the ruffle, to that area. Now the gathers that are at each end of the ruffle need to be a little bit tighter, a little more full, so that this ruffle will lie down flat. If you spread them out too much, then the ruffle will cup and kind of cup forward or back later on. So your gathers up in this area need to be pretty full up in that space, and then also up here at the neck. But then once you have those gathers pinned in place, you can pin all the rest of them down, distribute everything evenly across here, and put lots of pins to hold things in place. And then you can stitch this ruffle down to the front of the dress, 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Once you've done that, you can remove your gathering stitches, and we'll be ready to move to the next thing. Okay, now since we have the ruffle stitched onto the front of our dress, we are ready for step 9, and all that is sewing the shoulder seam. So we're going to take our front dress and our back dress and pin together, right sides together at each of the shoulders, and then we're going to do the same thing for our linings. Remember, I have my linings and I have them pinned at the shoulders. Remember, these are the pieces that have these 2 little extra strips on the bottom for our facing once we get to that part. So sew all of your shoulder seams. It should be 4 seams, and press everything open, and then we'll move to the next step. Okay, so we have finished step 9, and we've stitched our shoulder seams on both the outside of the dress and on the lining. In the next step, this is where we're going to start to veer away a little bit from the pattern instructions, but the very first step we're going to do the same. But what you're going to do is you're going to get your lining fabric, your bodice, which is sewn together at the shoulder seams, and you're going to lay it down with the right sides up. Then you're going to take the dress and you're going to put the right side down so that you have right sides together. And you're going to pin all the way up the front of the dress. This is that very front seam all the way up. So line up your raw edges all the way across the front. So I've got one side here, and then this side here is the one where I've previously stitched my ruffle. So my ruffle is kind of sandwiched in here in between these 2 pieces of fabric, in between my facing fabric and my outside. Now, whenever I look at this, I have a seam line right along here, and that's what I can use as my guide to sew all the way down. So we're going to sew just these front seams. We're not going to sew the neck, and we're not going to sew the armholes. If you're looking in the instructions, if you're making the sleeveless ginger, this would be when you would sew the armholes, but we are not going to do that. The only thing we're going to do is just straight down all the way down the front of both skirts. So once you have done that, you can take out your pins and fold everything to the outside, to the right side out, and press those edges, and then we'll be ready to go to the next step. So finishing up this step, our front seams are sewn and pressed down, and remember, we did not stitch the armholes. They are just still raw edges, but you went ahead and folded it out and pressed it. Now you need to pin everything together, matching your lining and your outside dress at the shoulder seams and at the arms, and we are going to just baste all around this raw edge with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, just to hold that in place and keep it from stretching as we work through the next steps. So that's the next thing. Okay, I have it all laid out. I have stitched all around with my basting stitch, and now we're going to skip forward in the pattern, and we are going to do the side seams. So we need to stitch the side seams of the dress and the side seams of the lining. So what you're going to do is I have already pinned some of these together, but you are going to put your lining sides together for each side, right sides together. I've got this side pinned, and here over on this other side, we're going to put these together like this and pin and then stitch those together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you're going to do the same thing on the side seams of the dress. So the whole side seam needs to be stitched all the way from the armhole area to the bottom of the skirt. Be sure that your yoke and skirt area, bodice and skirt areas match right in here where the skirt begins. Pin everything together. I've already got this side pinned, and you're going to stitch all the way down. After you have stitched the sides of the skirt, you need to finish that seam. You can do it with a serger or you can do it with a zigzag. Either one will be just fine. On the lining pieces, they just need to be pressed open. So go ahead and take care of sewing all 4 of those seams and finishing them or pressing them open, and come back and we'll move to the next step. Okay, with the side seams all complete, the next thing we need to do is to base these armholes, just the raw edges. We're going to base the lining to the outside of the dress. Before you do that, lay everything out and make sure you've got it nice and flat, that there isn't any puckering in these areas, and then go ahead and stitch all the way around each armhole, basting those pieces together. Next, we will get started on the sleeves. Okay, we're ready to get started on the sleeves. If you remember, I'm putting a Victoria sleeve on my dress. Whichever sleeve you are using, you need to follow the instructions for that pattern to construct those sleeves. So whatever it might be, it's the time to construct them now. I'm going to go over a little bit quickly how I'm going to do this Victoria sleeve. It's how the pattern does it, but since we're doing a sew along for this entire dress, I'm going to go ahead and do this. But we have 2 sleeve bands, and first thing you need to do is take each of the sleeve bands to the iron and press down 1/4 inch along one raw edge. So I've done that to both of these. And then you remember we have lots of pattern markings on a sleeve, and I have put all of those, I had already put all of those on here, but what we need to do now is remove my pattern piece and find those markings, and you should have an X, and it's a little hard to see on my fabric here, but I have an X here and I have another one up here, and I'm going to do some gathering stitches all along this top edge between those X's. I also have my front marked of my sleeve, and it's important that you have that marked on both of them. So I have these 2 X's up here at the top, and then I have another set of X's. There's one here and one here along the bottom edge. So I'm going to stitch gathering stitches between those X's also. So my first gathering stitch is going to be 1/8 inch away from the edge of the fabric, and the next one's going to be 3/8 inch. So go ahead and take care of doing all of your gathering stitches and the pressing of your sleeve bands, and then we will be ready to move on to the next step. Okay, now that we have our gathering stitches in place to the lower part of the sleeve and to the upper part of the sleeve, we're going to stitch the sleeve band in place. We're going to gather the sleeve to the sleeve band. So you are going to put the raw edge that is not pressed up to the raw edge of the sleeve. I'm going to flip this over actually so that we can put our pins on the side that's going to be gathered. So I'm going to line up these ends, and I'm going to just line it up nice and straight up to the point where my gathering stitches start. And I'm going to put a pin right in there where the gathering stitches are, and then I'm going to come and do the same thing on the other, lining up this end and then taking it straight up and putting a pin right where the gathering stitches start. There is a section of the sleeve here that goes under the arm that doesn't have gathers. It's nice and flat and smooth. And so now I've got this situation, so I need to pull up these top 2 gathering threads, pull this fabric up so that it all matches. So you're going to do a little bit on each side until you get it all the way pulled up, and then secure on the end of those pins, and this is what you're going to have when you get done. So go ahead and do both sides like this, pulling up your gathers to match your sleeve band. After you've done that, you can stitch all the way along this edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then press your facing down, and we will go from there. So you have your sleeve and your sleeve band stitched together, and I had you go on and press this nice and flat in here. One thing to do that I didn't mention that I do always do in this situation is trim this seam just a little bit so that the edges all line up and it's nice and smooth. So this would be trimmed down to about a scant 1/4 inch. That's just going to help as we wrap this facing around, or wrap this band around in the next step. But so go on and trim that where your edges are nice and evened up, and then you're going to take your short ends and put them together. Pin these like this, and we are going to stitch these ends, the short ends here. So go to the sewing machine and you're going to stitch across this end of each of the sleeves, being sure that your seam allowances on both this front side and the back side stay pointed down that way, because we want them to all be enclosed in the sleeve band once we get to the next step. So stitch both of those short seams. After you've stitched it, go on and finish this seam, because this part of the sleeve here is actually going to be kind of exposed on the inside. So you'll need to finish this with a zigzag or serger across here as well, even though it's a really tiny little piece. So that's what I've done here with this. I have my seam stitched and I have zigzagged it here. And now the next step, we have our sleeve band pressed like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this band, which we have one raw edge pressed over and the other edge stitched, and we are just going to wrap it around the inside. And your fold should line up very nicely right there with the stitching line where you stitched it down. So fold that over, and then you're going to take a needle and thread and just whip that down by hand all the way around. So do all of those steps, and then we will be finished with the bottom of our sleeve, and we can work to putting it in our dress. Okay, now that we have our cute little sleeves constructed in the bottom half and all finished off there, we're ready to put them into the dress. Let's be sure that you pay attention to which is the front of the sleeve and which is the back of the sleeve. You should have it marked. Just be sure that you are placing them in the right area. So I've got my front marking right here. This is the front of this bodice, so I'm going to just be sure that I'm lining them up with my right sides together like this. So I'm going to go from the inside here, and I'm going to line up the underarm seams and place a pin in that. You can see my blue basting thread on here. That will be covered up here in just a minute. So once you have that underarm seam pinned in place, then you can begin pinning your sleeve in place all the way around. And you're going to pin it, nice and flat up until you get to the part where you have your X, where your gathering stitches start. So it's going to be just a smooth sleeve underneath the arms up until those gathering stitches start on both sides. Then after you're to that point, you're going to gather up everything so that it all matches. And then you're going to have something that looks like this. So I have got everything lined up, and then my sleeve is gathered to fit this armhole here. Once you have everything gathered up in this way, you can go to the machine and stitch all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've done that, trim everything down so that your edges are nice and even and you don't have these little ravelly bits, and then finish this edge in your preferred way, whether serger or zigzag. So do that to both sleeves, and then we will be ready to move on. Okay, so with the sleeves on, this is really starting to come together. We are going to move right on back over to the instructions for the dress, and we are now on step 12, and we're going to follow that through the rest of the pattern. But the first thing you need to do in step 12 is to go ahead and work your top buttonhole. This is going to be on the right-hand side of the dress. It's a lot easier to do this buttonhole if you go ahead and do it now before the neckband. So we're just going to do this top buttonhole. It's horizontal, and there's a placement markings on your pattern piece that you can transfer if you haven't already done that, but that buttonhole needs to be done next. So once you've done that, you're going to be ready to move to the actual ruffle. So what we're going to do with that, you have this one long piece for your neck ruffle, and you are going to take it and fold it in half lengthwise. After you've folded it in half lengthwise like this, you are going to go and stitch across this end right along here along the short end. After you've stitched, trim it to 1/4 of an inch and then turn it from the outside, turn the right sides out. And once you've done that, you'll end up with a nice little end that looks like this. Just squared off and looks good. And then you're going to press the entire ruffle like this with the right sides out, wrong sides together, all the way down. So stitch both ends like this and press everything like this. After you have it pressed, you'll be ready for some gathering stitches. So it's going to be 1/8 of an inch from the edge and 3/8 of an inch from the edge, from the raw edge on this completed ruffle piece. So after you've done all those things, we'll be ready to get it put onto the dress. Okay, I know y'all are ready for your last gathering experience of this dress. We've done a lot of it, but we are ready now to put the neck ruffle onto the neck. If you remember, on your bodice, your front bodice piece, there is a mark that we made in one of the very first steps. That is the ruffle placement line for the left front bodice. So it is right over in this area on the left-hand side of the bodice, left-hand side of the dress, and you need to line the edge of your finished ruffle right up there with that line. Then if you come around to the right-hand side, it needs to go just to the very edge of the dress. That's where your ruffle is going to line up there. Once you have those pinned in place, then you can pull your threads and pull up this entire ruffle to fit the neck. Once you've got it all distributed evenly and looking nicely, you can stitch this all the way around and stitch that ruffle in place. So we are on step 15 at this point. We've already got this ruffle stitched in place to the neck, and now I have my neckband. It's our last piece left that we haven't used. First thing that you need to do is go to the ironing board and fold with wrong sides together up 1/4 of an inch on one long edge and press that. After you've done that, we are going to begin pinning this to the neck. Now this raw edge of the neckband needs to stick out past the edge of the front edge of the dress, right up in here, 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to do this, put the raw edge that's not been folded and pressed down, and I'm going to have 1/4 of an inch sticking off the edge. And then I can just begin to pin all the way around this dress. Now, anytime that I am putting a bias band on a neck, pretty much any pattern, I am stretching just slightly as I pin. And that little bit of stretch that you put in the neckband as you pin it going around is going to help it lie a little more smoothly as it's stitched. So I'm not stretching it a lot, but just a little bit going around. Just makes a nicer neckband. So we are going to go all the way around the entire neck. Now, when we get over to the end, it's possible, since we've stretched this a little bit, that we're going to have more than 1/4 of an inch hanging off the other end. And that's okay if you do. You just need to trim it to where there's 1/4 of an inch hanging past the other front edge of the neck. So once you have this pinned all the way around, then you can go and stitch right along the edge at 1/4 of an inch to stitch this neckband down in place all the way around from one side to the other. So we have the neckband stitched in place with 1/4 of an inch extra hanging out over each end, stitched all the way across. The next thing that I do, it doesn't say to do this in the instructions, but I always have to do this, or almost always, especially with fabric of this weight, you're going to need to trim this seam a little bit. I would say to a scant 1/4 of an inch, just to even up everything. And you know, this is quite a few layers of fabric in here, and we're going to wrap this band around it. If you were using something super lightweight like Liberty or something like that, you probably wouldn't have to, you may not have to trim that, but it does make it a lot nicer and a lot easier to wrap around if you've trimmed that down and evened up all of this all the way around the neck. So I would trim that, And then the next step is to finish these ends of this hanging over on the neckband. So I have it stitched, and then I also have it pressed and folded. What we're going to do is put what's going to be the right sides together. So I'm going to fold it back upon itself like this. And then I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to stitch straight across here. After I've stitched that, then I'm going to trim this a little shorter and flip it around to the other side. So I'll show you what that means here. On this side, I've got this little end piece, and I've stitched across the end just right along the edge, right along this edge here. I've stitched, and then I've trimmed this off. It's a little bit more than 1/8. And then after that, all you have to do is fold everything, fold the right side out, and you may need to use some kind of little tool to turn that point and to get that edge up in there, but this is what it should look like, and we can press it a little bit too. This is what it should look like when it's done, just stitched on the end here. And now, once you've done that and you've gotten that corner all back in there, you can take this folded edge and pin it down around the inside of that neck edge all the way around, and pin that, and then whip stitch it all the way around, and then your neckband will be completely finished. Okay, with the neckband all stitched in place, we are ready for just finishing up the final touches of this dress, and then we will be all done. So what that means that we have left is the hem next. And you know, your ruffle, it came down, your ruffle did not come all the way down to the bottom of your dress. What you should have room for is enough room at the bottom of your hem to turn under 1/4 inch, and then also turn up 3 inches. Once you do that, that's going to put your ruffle right there at the very bottom edge of your hem. I'm going to pin that in place, and you can pin this all the way around. I've lost my pin. Anyway, pin it all the way around and hem your dress. Since we're doing the unlined version, this is very, very easy. I know I told you earlier about moving that mark. We didn't actually even need that mark in doing this view of the dress. So anyway, now you know if you make the other view of the dress that there is a little dot that needs to be moved to a different spot. But anyway, so the hem would be next. Go ahead and you can hem it by hand, or you can do a blind hem on your machine. Once you've done that, the next thing is to finish up the inside of this lining. Everything needs to just be pressed under this 1/2 inch seam allowance that we had on the lining. If you press that under 1/2 inch, then that folded edge should line up with your stitching line for your skirt, and you can whip that down in place so that you'll have a nice finished inside bodice of your dress. So that would be after the hem. And then finally, after that, we will do buttons and buttonholes. Now we have our first little buttonhole that's hiding up underneath this little ruffle up here, which I'm actually super glad that I went ahead and did that already, because that would have really been a pain, difficult to try to get a buttonhole right up there so close to that ruffle. But that one is hiding there, and then you'll have your the rest of your buttonholes to do. And the top one up here was horizontal. The rest of these are vertical, going down the bottom of the dress. And then you'll have your buttons to do over on this side. So once you get all that done, you will have the finished dress. And I am going to call it quits for now. And the next time you see this dress, it'll be all finished up. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a fun dress to sew, and happy sewing.